The morning everything started falling apart, I thought I was the victim. By lunchtime, it turned out somebody else had a much bigger problem. At exactly 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, I heard pounding on my front door so hard I honestly thought somebody's house was on fire. When I opened it, my neighbor, Linda Harper, was standing there in pink slippers and an oversized sweatshirt, looking like she'd just run a marathon. "Ethan, you need to come outside. Right now." There was something in her voice that made my stomach drop before I even stepped onto the porch. I followed her around the side of my house, and for a second my brain refused to process what I was looking at. 3 full sections of my cedar privacy fence were lying flat on the ground. Not blown over, not damaged by weather. Cut. Every single post had been sliced clean near the base. It looked like somebody had taken a giant pair of scissors to 4 years of work. Then I saw the notice. A bright yellow sheet stapled to one of the fence panels. The letterhead belonged to the Brookstone Ridge Homeowners Association. I didn't even finish reading the first sentence before I started laughing. Not because it was funny, because sometimes when something is so unbelievably stupid, your brain just doesn't know what else to do. According to the notice, my fence had been removed due to non-compliance with updated community appearance standards. Removed. Not cited. Not disputed. Removed. Like they were talking about an abandoned shopping cart instead of a structure sitting entirely on private property. Linda looked at me and said, "Please tell me you gave them permission." I shook my head. "Nope." "Then they're insane." "That," I said, staring at the pile of lumber that used to be my fence, "is becoming increasingly obvious." Now here's the thing. This wasn't some fence I built over a weekend after watching too many DIY videos. For years earlier, I'd done everything by the book. Survey, permit, inspections, property line verification. The city approved it. The county recorded it. Every post sat comfortably inside my lot boundary. In fact, during annual HOA inspections, nobody had ever mentioned it. Not once. For years, it was just another fence in another backyard. But then our neighborhood elected a new HOA president named Russell Kane. If you've ever lived around someone who mistakes authority for wisdom, you already know the type. Russell loved meetings, loved rules, loved hearing himself explain why everybody else was wrong. Before becoming president, he was just another retiree walking his dog around the subdivision. After becoming president, he acted like he'd been sworn in as governor. The first time we really crossed paths was during a community meeting about landscaping. Somebody suggested spending money repairing cracked sidewalks. Russell spent 20 minutes talking about decorative consistency instead. That's when I realized he cared more about appearances than actual problems. A few months later, he stopped me while I was mowing the lawn. "You ever think about replacing that fence?" he asked. "Why would I?" I replied. "Looks a little rustic." I laughed. "It's a cedar fence, Russell. Rustic is kind of the point." He didn't laugh back. Looking back now, maybe this should have been my warning sign. Because over the next year, he became obsessed with what he called neighborhood image. Suddenly people were receiving letters about mailbox colors, flower bed dimensions, even patio furniture. It got ridiculous. Every month there seemed to be a new rule nobody had asked for. Most people grumbled, but paid the fines. I wasn't interested in fighting every battle, so I mostly stayed out of it. Then one afternoon, about 6 months before the fence incident, Russell knocked on my door carrying a folder. "We've been reviewing older structures," he said. "Your fence may require modifications." "According to what?" I asked. He flipped through papers dramatically. "Updated aesthetic guidelines." "The fence predates those guidelines." "That doesn't necessarily exempt it." "Actually, it does." He didn't like that answer. I could tell. But eventually he left. I figured that was the end of it. It wasn't. What I didn't know was that Russell had convinced himself my fence was some kind of symbol. Every time he looked at it, he saw resistance. Every time I questioned a rule, he took it personally. The fence wasn't really the issue anymore. It was pride. And pride has a funny way of making smart people do incredibly expensive things. About 2 years before all this happened, I'd noticed another issue developing behind my property. Running along the HOA common area was a decorative stone retaining wall built long before I moved into the neighborhood. It wasn't especially large, maybe 4 feet high, but I remember noticing a slight lean after a particularly wet winter. Most people would have ignored it. I probably would have too if my background hadn't included years working around construction projects. Something about the angle bothered me. Every few months I'd glance at it and notice the lean getting slightly worse. Not dramatic, just enough to catch my attention. One afternoon, my friend Mark, a structural engineer, stopped by for a barbecue. While we were standing near the property line, I pointed toward the wall. Am I imagining things, or is that moving? He studied it for a minute. You're not imagining it. Bad. Not today, he said, but I wouldn't ignore it. That answer stayed with me longer than I expected. Over the following months, I took photos whenever I noticed changes. Nothing official, just observations. The kind of thing homeowners do when something doesn't feel right. What I never realized was that my fence and that wall were about to become part of the same story. And standing there that Tuesday morning, staring at 3 destroyed fence sections and a yellow HOA notice fluttering in the breeze, I had absolutely no idea that Russell Kane had just removed the one thing quietly helping hold his biggest problem together. For the first couple of hours after discovering the fence, I was too busy dealing with the obvious problem to think much about anything else. I took photographs from every angle, called the county office to confirm my permit records were still on file, and left a message with an attorney I knew through a former client. The entire time, I kept expecting my phone to ring with some explanation from Russell or somebody on the HOA board. It never did. Nobody called. Nobody apologized. Nobody even attempted to justify what had happened. That silence told me more than any conversation could have. They knew exactly what they'd done. Around 8:30, Linda came back over carrying 2 coffees. We sat on my back patio, staring at the wreckage. So what happens now? She asked. I shrugged. Honestly, I figure they either rebuild it or we end up in court. She took a sip and looked toward the common area behind my property. You know that stone wall looks worse than usual. I followed her gaze. She was right. Maybe it was because the fence was gone and I had a clearer view, but the wall seemed different somehow. Not dramatically different, just strained, like somebody holding a heavy piece of furniture by themselves after their helper suddenly lets go. The thought crossed my mind and disappeared almost immediately. I had bigger concerns, or at least I thought I did. Around 10 o'clock, I was inside gathering paperwork when I heard a sound that didn't belong. It started as a sharp crack, then another, then a deep grinding noise that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. At first, I thought a truck had backed into something. Then came shouting. Lots of shouting. I stepped on my back deck and saw 3 people running across the common area. One of them was pointing frantically toward the decorative wall. That's when I saw it move. To this day, I can still picture the exact moment. A 12-foot section near the center bowed outward, hesitated for half a second, then collapsed in a wave of stone, mortar, and dirt. The sound was unbelievable. Thousands of pounds of material crashing onto the ground all at once. Dust shot into the air. Chunks of rock rolled across the grass. Somebody yelled, "Oh my God!" Another person pulled out a phone. Within minutes, the area looked like the scene of a construction accident. Residents gathered along the walking path. Board members started arriving. Maintenance workers showed up. Everyone had questions. Nobody had answers. Well, almost nobody, because standing there watching that wall lie in pieces, I remembered something Mark had said during that barbecue 2 years earlier. You're not imagining it. Not today, but I wouldn't ignore it. Suddenly, every photograph I'd taken came flooding back into my memory. Every little sign of movement. Every season of gradual shifting. Every indication that the wall had been struggling for years. Then another realization hit me. My fence had run parallel to that wall, with less than 2 feet of space between them. For 4 years, the cedar panels had created a secondary barrier along the backside. Not designed for support, obviously, but support doesn't always care about intent. Structures interact with each other. Pressure moves. Soil shifts. Loads redistribute. Remove one piece from a system, and sometimes another piece discovers it was depending on that support more than anyone realized. I called Mark. The second he answered, I said, "The wall collapsed." There was a pause. Which wall? The HOA decorative wall. Another pause. Then, when? About 3 hours after they cut down my fence. Silence. Long silence. Finally, he said, "That's not ideal. That's one way to put it. Take photographs of everything." "Already doing it." "Take more." So I did. By noon, I had hundreds of images. The collapsed section, the debris field, the exposed soil behind the wall, the area where my fence posts had been removed. Everything. Meanwhile, the HOA board was scrambling. I watched them huddle together in small groups. I saw contractors arrive. I saw people pointing at diagrams. Nobody looked happy. Around 1 o'clock, Russell finally appeared. He marched across the grass with the confidence of a man trying desperately to look confident. The second he spotted me, he changed direction and headed straight over. "Ethan," he said, "quite a situation." I actually laughed. "Quite a situation." "The wall failure appears unexpected." "Unexpected?" I repeated. "You cut down a structure that's been sitting next to it for years." His jaw tightened. "There's no evidence the fence was structurally relevant." "Really?" I said. "You have an engineering report?" "Do you?" That question almost made me smile. Because unlike Russell, I had spent years paying attention. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe I do." His expression changed instantly. Just a flicker, barely noticeable, but it was there. For the first time all day, Russell looked worried. The next several days turned into a whirlwind of inspections, meetings, insurance reviews, and legal consultations. The HOA hired an engineering consultant. Their insurance carrier hired another. The county became interested after learning a permitted structure had been removed without the owner's consent. Every new conversation seemed to make things worse for the association. During one inspection, I provided copies of photographs I'd taken over the previous 2 years. The engineer reviewing them spent nearly 20 minutes studying the progression. "You documented this yourself?" he asked. "Yeah." "Why?" I shrugged. Something looked off. He nodded slowly. "Good instinct." Then came the drainage issue. Once the collapsed section exposed the interior structure, investigators discovered evidence of long-term water infiltration, improper drainage, shallow footings, soil movement, problems that had existed long before the collapse, problems that should have been addressed years earlier, problems Russell and the board either never knew about or never wanted to spend money fixing. Neither explanation looked particularly good. A week later, Mark reviewed the findings with me over lunch. "The wall was already compromised," he explained. "Think of it like a guy standing on a bad knee. He can stay upright for a while. Then somebody takes away the handrail he's leaning against, and down he goes." "Exactly. So the fence really mattered?" Mark leaned back in his chair. "Let's put it this way. If somebody intentionally removed a neighboring structure that was providing lateral resistance without evaluating consequences first, I wouldn't want to be defending that decision." By then, word had spread through the entire neighborhood. Every mailbox conversation seemed to involve the wall. Every dog walk turned into an unofficial town hall meeting. Residents who had quietly tolerated Russell's leadership for years suddenly started asking uncomfortable questions. Why was private property removed without notice? Why hadn't the wall been inspected sooner? Why were community funds now facing a massive repair bill? One evening, I attended a board meeting packed with homeowners. I've never seen anything like it. People lined the walls. Some stood outside the doors. The tension felt electric. Russell opened with a prepared statement about unforeseen circumstances. A woman in the third row immediately interrupted him. "The unforeseen circumstance was electing you." Half the room burst into applause. Another resident stood up and demanded explanations. Then another. Then another. For nearly 2 hours, the board absorbed criticism from every direction. And sitting there listening, I realized something important. This was no longer about my fence. The fence had simply exposed a deeper issue. People were tired of leadership driven by ego instead of responsibility. They were tired of decisions made for appearances rather than practical reality. Most of all, they were tired of being treated like obstacles instead of neighbors. The turning point came when the HOA's insurance investigator completed his report. According to multiple people familiar with the findings, the sequence of events was remarkably clear. The decorative wall had known structural deficiencies. My fence had provided incidental stabilization along a critical section. The unauthorized removal altered existing load conditions. The collapse followed shortly afterward. In plain English, the wall had been failing for years, but the action that finally pushed it over the edge came from the very people responsible for protecting community property. The moment those conclusions started circulating, everything changed. The confident statements disappeared. The excuses became quieter. And Russell Kane, the man who had spent months trying to prove he was the smartest person in Brookstone Ridge, suddenly found himself at the center of a disaster that was becoming impossible to explain away. By the time summer rolled around, the story had stopped being about a fence, a wall, or even a single bad decision. It had become the kind of neighborhood saga people brought up at backyard cookouts and holiday gatherings, the kind of story that somehow grew a little every time it got retold. What never changed, though, were the facts. The more investigators reviewed documents, photographs, permits, inspection records, and contractor reports, the harder it became for anyone to argue with what had actually happened. The wall had problems long before the collapse. My fence had never been the problem. The problem was that people in positions of authority had convinced themselves they could make decisions first and ask questions later. And eventually, reality sent them the bill. About 6 weeks after the collapse, the HOA held what would become the most heavily attended board meeting in the neighborhood's history. Residents filled every chair. Others stood along the walls. A few people even watched through the open doorway from the hallway outside. Nobody was there because they cared about a cedar fence. They were there because they wanted accountability. Russell sat at the front table looking 10 years older than he had a couple of months earlier. The confidence was gone. The smug little smile he used to wear during meetings had disappeared. Even his voice sounded different when he started reading from a prepared statement. He talked about unfortunate outcomes, communication breakdowns, procedural errors, lessons learned. The usual language people use when they don't want to say the words, "We messed up." Then one resident raised her hand and asked the question everyone had been waiting to hear. Did the board authorize contractors to enter private property and remove a permitted structure without the homeowner's consent? The room went completely silent. Russell looked toward the association attorney. The attorney looked back at him. Nobody seemed eager to answer. Finally, after a pause that felt like it lasted an hour, the attorney said, "Based on the records reviewed, procedures were not properly followed." A man near the back laughed and said, "That's the nicest way I've ever heard someone describe a disaster." Even Russell couldn't argue with that. The insurance findings had already landed. The engineering reviews were complete. The county had verified my permits. The photographs established a timeline. The contractors confirmed who ordered the removal. Piece by piece, every excuse had fallen apart. The board voted that night to cover the full cost of rebuilding my fence. Not a partial reimbursement. Not a compromise. A complete replacement. Professionally installed. Fully permitted. Built at the association's expense. Then came the wall repairs. The estimates were significantly higher than anyone wanted to admit publicly. Once engineers began addressing drainage issues, footing deficiencies, and stabilization requirements, the numbers climbed fast. Homeowners who had spent years listening to lectures about protecting community finances suddenly learned exactly how expensive bad leadership could become. A few weeks later, construction crews arrived. And I'll admit something here that probably isn't my proudest moment. Every morning I'd sit on my back patio with a cup of coffee and watch them work. Not because I enjoyed seeing people struggle. Not because I wanted revenge. It was simply impossible not to appreciate the irony. The same association that had destroyed my fence in a matter of minutes was now spending months and thousands of dollars rebuilding everything that decision had damaged. One afternoon, I happened to run into Russell near the mailbox cluster. It was the first time we'd spoken alone since the collapse. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then he cleared his throat. "Looks like the new fence is coming along." I glanced toward the construction crews. "Sure does." Another awkward silence followed. Finally, he said, "Things got more complicated than anyone expected." I looked at him for a moment. "No," Rue said. "They got exactly as complicated as they were always going to get. The difference is nobody bothered checking before making decisions." He didn't respond. There wasn't really anything left to say. A month later, the rebuilt fence was finished. Honestly, it looked better than the original. Stronger posts, better materials, meilleure installation. Standing there looking at it, I found myself thinking about how strange the entire experience had been. For years earlier, I'd built a simple fence to mark a property line and create a little privacy. I never imagined it would become the center of a battle over authority, pride, and responsibility. I definitely never imagined its removal would expose structural problems that had been hiding in plain sight for years. But life has a funny way of revealing things. Sometimes people become so focused on controlling what they can see that they completely ignore what's happening underneath. And eventually, what's underneath decides it has had enough. The biggest surprise came a few months later during the annual HOA election. Residents voted in record numbers. Several board positions changed hands. Russell resigned before the end of his term. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, most people already knew the truth. Trust is hard to rebuild once it's broken. Harder than fences. Harder than walls. Harder than reputations. Even now, years later, neighbors still bring up the story occasionally. Usually somebody points toward the rebuilt wall and says something like, "Remember when that whole mess happened?" Then everyone laughs. But every time I hear it, I think about something different. I think about that Tuesday morning. I think about standing beside 3 destroyed fence sections, feeling angry and powerless, convinced I was looking at the worst part of my day. What I didn't realize was that the people responsible had already set their own downfall in motion. They just couldn't see it yet. And maybe that's the lesson that stuck with me more than anything else. Sometimes the thing people rush to tear down isn't the obstacle they think it is. Sometimes it's the only thing quietly holding their side together. And once it's gone, all the problems they've ignored come crashing into view at once. So now I'm curious what you think. Was the HOA simply incompetent, or did pride and power turn a small disagreement into a disaster nobody could stop? Have you ever dealt with someone who became so obsessed with being right that they ended up creating the very problem they were trying to avoid? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and stick around, because trust me, some of the neighborhood battles I've witnessed over the years make this one look almost reasonable.